Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Wildfire Effects on Wildlife webinar series, day 2. This is a joint webinar brought to you by the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network and the Association for Fire Ecology. My name is Corey Davis, and I am the Science Communication Specialist for the Northern Rockies Fire Science Network. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm just going to run through a few quick logistics here. First of all, if you're having audio problems, you should have call-in instructions and links in the calendar invite you should have gotten. And this webinar is being recorded and it'll be posted to the Northern Rockies YouTube channel. You can see the address there. You can also look up NR Fire Science in YouTube. Please put any questions you have for our speakers in the chat window today. And closed captions are available. You just need to hit the live transcript button at the bottom. We also have Wildlife Society and Society of American Foresters continuing education credits available for this. So if you're part of either of those programs and would like to get credits, you'll need to submit a claim. I'll be sure to submit the list of attendees. And then finally, at the end, there will be a survey that pops up. I'd really appreciate it if you could fill that out after you leave. It'll only take a few seconds and it really helps us out. So I just wanted to say a few words about the Fire Science Exchange Program. The Northern Rockies Fire Science Network is part of one of 15 different networks across the country run through the Joint Fire Science Program. And excuse me, our job is to help bring the latest fire scientists to fire managers. And so we run a lot of activities like today's webinar. And we have a lot of research briefs, science reviews. We also do field trips and workshops. So please check us out. We also have a very thorough fire science research database if you're looking for certain articles on topics. So yeah, that's all available at our website. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Gavin Jones, who's going to talk a little bit about this series and introduce our speakers. So go ahead, Gavin.
All right, thanks, Corey, and thanks everyone for joining today. So this is week 2 of 3 weeks where we're going to be talking about and highlighting some of the papers that appeared in the special collection in the journal Fire Ecology, with the focus on wildfire and prescribed fire effects on wildlife. Now, this collection originated as a symposium outcome from a Wildlife Society symposium a couple of years back, but it is expanded to include a number of other studies and areas of interest that didn't occur in that original symposium. So a really fun collection of work that has spanned a whole bunch of taxa and a whole bunch of systems. And I would encourage you to go to this webpage here that's shown in the hyperlink. It's just springeropen.com collections wildfire. Go check it out. There's about 11 papers in the issue right now, and we're looking to add a couple of more before we sort of close out the issue. So really exciting stuff. Go check it out. And the purpose of these seminars is just to highlight a few of those contributions and get us all thinking about some of these issues together. So why don't you go to the next slide, Corey? And because when we work with cuddly critters, we can't refuse an opportunity to look at them. These are just some of the species that various papers have focused on in different ways in this special collection. So everything from spotted owls to fruit bats to brown bears, and the list goes on. So if any of these sound interesting to you, go and check out this special issue, and you'll hear from some of these speakers today. So next slide. So last week we heard from a few research scientists within the U.S. Forest Service research stations. We went from the Pacific Northwest to the Rocky Mountain Research Station over to the Southern Research Station, hearing about some work on northern spotted owls, on the effect of prescribed fire on bird communities, and also bats. Really interesting stuff. This week, we're going to be hearing from another set of speakers. First is Peter Coates from the USGS Western Ecological Research Center. Next, Alissa Fogg from Point Blue Conservation Science. And finally, Greg Albery from Georgetown. Some fun topics today as well. And then next week, we will be doing a bit of a synthesis. So I'm going to work to think about how all these pieces of the puzzle fit together, and talking about an outlook on some of the fire issues that we maybe should be thinking about as a community. And we're also going to be ending next week with a panel discussion that'll include some of the speakers, as well as other scientists and experts in this area. So definitely encourage you to come and visit us next week as well. Same time, same place. And hopefully we'll have a fun discussion. But for this week, let's go ahead and transition and talk, get to our first speaker. So our first speaker today is Peter Coates. And so let's see, my introduction for Peter just disappeared. So sorry about that. But Peter is with the USGS Western Ecological Research Center. Maybe I didn't say that correctly, but Peter, maybe you can give yourself an introduction if I just got it wrong, and I'll make sure to get my page up for the other speakers. But we're really excited to have you here, and thank you for your contribution to the special collection. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, and you can share your screen.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Thank you, Gavin. Appreciate that. Yep. My name is Peter Coates. I'm a research wildlife biologist with Western Ecological Research Center and part of the USGS. And I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Let me know if you could see it.
And we're seeing your screen show up, Peter. One thing I'll add, just as a general housekeeping thing here, is that we are going to be holding questions until the end. So if you do have a question for one of the speakers, go ahead and jot it down or drop it in the chat just to get it off your brain. And at the end of the three presentations, we will come back and have some time to discuss. So I just wanted to note that, and go ahead, Peter.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Well, I'll go ahead and get started here. And yeah, good afternoon. Very pleased to be here. I decided to expand the topic a little bit with some permission beyond the peripheral population, because we've done a lot of work on wildfire with sage-grouse populations, and I wanted to give you a little bit broader perspective and then zero in on some field sites to show some of the processes of this. So the talk is titled here, Wildfire, Climate, and Invasive Grass Interactions Adversely Affect Sage-Grouse by Reshaping Sagebrush Ecosystems. This has been a large collaboration across federal and state agencies. I especially want to thank the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies for providing a massive LEC database that's been going back to the 1960s, of which we've done some of this work. And I also want to acknowledge all my co-authors here. There's plenty of other folks too. Many other folks have been involved in the research, but these are the folks who have been real instrumental in this work. Okay, with that, I'll go ahead and get started here. As most of you know, sage-grouse kind of make the headlines. They're an indicator for the health of the sagebrush ecosystem. They've been thought of as an umbrella species for the protection of many other species, largely because of the landscape they use, the different types of habitats they require within sagebrush ecosystems to meet their life history needs across their annual cycle. And their populations have been declining. A report recently published showed about 2.9% annual declines dating back to the 1960s. When you correct for kind of the stochasticity in their populations, those are this interannual variation that you see back in time. The trends are actually quite remarkably similar through these time periods, denoted by the different colors there. Essentially, about 80.1% of grouse have been lost over 55 years. There's been many factors that have contributed to this. We know that climatic conditions also influence those, essentially the interannual variation we see. But the loss of habitat has been really responsible for these long-term declines, and largely related to wildfire has created a reduction in carrying capacity for these populations by limiting the amount of resources available, even when precipitation is high. We're seeing now a different fire cycle, as most of you are very familiar with, depending on where you are in sagebrush ecosystems. where invasive grasses are invading a lot of these sites. And with that, we end up with a transition from a shrub community to a full grass community. And this is problematic for species like sage-grouse or sagebrush obligates. So I'm going to talk about that through the talk here. And what we actually did, the objectives here are to develop a post-burn sagebrush recovery model to estimate annual net sagebrush loss. This allows us to get at the chronic impacts of wildfire. So it's not just the flames per se that has an acute response, or birds have an acute response to that, but more the loss of habitat, what that means in years out. I'll talk about using this LEC database, how we looked at interactions between climatic conditions and those long-term effects of wildfire on sage-grouse populations and the variation across the range. And then dig into a couple of specific sites to show essentially the process that's responsible for that pattern as we evaluate different life stages of the birds and what wildfire means for these different life stages. So to start, we put together a sagebrush recovery model, and this model relies on major sources of data. One is the wildfire data set published recently in 2021, which combines a lot of different information from different wildfire data sets so that we have a clear understanding of burn perimeters that have occurred back in time. So we can look at this post-fire landscape and identify within that landscape what the recovery potential is across the different types of vegetation communities. Focusing on sagebrush communities, we used the literature essentially across much of the range to establish rates of growth of these different species of sagebrush. And then we allowed those rates to vary by the resiliency and resistancy of that landscape, which has been published in other types of products and maps available for that. Putting this model together allows us to get at a post-recovery landscape where we could calculate net sagebrush loss. And of course, with new fires that occur in these areas, it resets those pixel values. In areas with high resilience, high resistance, we end up with faster recovery of those sagebrush communities. Now, what I'm going to show here on the left figure is the net sagebrush loss depicted in the red, and then in the purple is sage-grouse habitat, just to give you an idea of how much wildfire and the loss of sagebrush it overlaps with sage-grouse distribution in their habitat areas. On the right figure, you have annual habitat loss on one axis and cumulative habitat loss on the other one across years. And you could see just that this is coming in pulses, if you will, with larger burn and how much it accumulates to be, which is about 262,000 hectares of habitat lost per year calculated over the last 10 years. So that figure is quite staggering. Quite a bit of habitat is either in some state of recovery or transitioning to cheatgrass. So what does that mean for sage-grouse populations? Well, we have a real fortunate to have all of these Western agencies across 11 different states come together with some federal agencies to develop a unified LEC database that dates back to the 1960s. We split it out into different climate clusters, if you will. These are just clusters of LECs that you can see color coded on that figure there, so that we could look at regional variation in different effects, in this case, fire. And we used a Bayesian state space modeling process. This essentially allows us to account for the imperfect detection of birds on LECs while we can estimate the rate of change in population sizes. Okay, so when we look at the results to that study, we see and we're still in the process of finishing this study. So these are all preliminary data, but we do see that a 50 square kilometer increase in burned areas decreased lambda by about 2.3%. It gets a little more complex from there. The right figure shows an interaction of that net sagebrush loss with seasonal precipitation. And the green portion of that plane represents areas, if you will, across those continuum of values of which we have positive growth rates. And you can see that's a very small section of our data sets that we've acquired here over that entire plane. So there's a lot of room, if you will, with net sagebrush loss for declining populations depicted by the orange and the purple there. And the mean precipitation there, you could see that line represented. I'm going to back up just to break this down a little bit. When you look at precipitation alone without net sagebrush loss, that's that black line, putting it more in a two-dimensional figure here. We have years of high precipitation, for example, the El Nino years, and then low precipitation with La Nina. And you could see here that we oscillate kind of back and forth. And sage-grouse populations are doing something similar with these pulses of precipitation. They get increases depicted by the cartoon graphic on the right side, and then they decline when we move into more lower precipitation periods. So they're kind of moving back and forth along that black line there. But interestingly, if a lek has some level of burn that occurs around it, for example, in this case, say 1700 hectare, we see that a nullification, if you will, or nullifying effect here of the precipitation pattern and this long-term trajectory moving downward, even though we still have oscillations in these population numbers. Now, the cartoon graphic very much represents theoretically what the actual data do when we look back at the figure that I brought up earlier, range-wide. Of course, wildfire is not the only impact to these sage-grouse populations, but one of the most threatening is it's removing so much habitat, as I pointed out in the last couple of slides. We're also seeing the amplitude of these cycles decreasing also through time. And this is largely one because of we have a reduction in carrying capacity, so fewer birds to reproduce. So even with growth rates stable through time and the max growth rate consistent, we just can't get back to those number of birds just because we have fewer individuals in the breeding population as we lose that habitat. So the worst case scenario is when we get out to about 38% of the area around these leks burned. This amounts to essentially no reprieve from precipitation and just a plummeting population. We're seeing this in a lot of peripheral populations, which the article that is in the special issue talks about a specific population there where we're seeing some really substantial declines, is also shown by the cartoon graphic there. Now, when we take all those modeled parameter estimates and look at essentially predict out into the future across different R&R, the different R&R, the different color codes there, red being low R&R and yellow being high R&R, we can see that this doesn't bode well for sage-grouse across the entire range, all the climate clusters, although there is some variation in this. There's some areas where, for example, the Bi-State, Jackson, and Eastern Range, in some areas, wildfire is actually okay for sage-grouse populations. But when we look to the Great Basin in Washington, we're seeing something that looks really dire if the wildfire cycle, annual grass cycle, continue unabated, especially in Washington. That's the green population there you see on the left figure, which has been subjected to quite a bit of wildfire in the last 3 years, and we've lost a lot of populations because of that. But most alarming is the Great Basin because it holds about 25% of the population's range wide, and you can see how tight the credible limits are on that, a clear indication or evidence that wildfire is impacting these birds for such a large landscape. Okay, so that's the pattern. I'm going to now talk about the process and kind of zoom in here to a few sites, the Rush Fire, Virginia Mountains Complex, Long Valley Fire, and the Martin Fire. Now, in order to get information about the impacts across different population vital rates, we need to capture birds and mark them in their areas and be able to follow them through each of these different life history phases. So this video is just kind of showing a little fun video here to break up some of the figures, but how we actually capture these birds. We put GPS transmitters on the back of them. This gives us real fine scale information and great information about survival probabilities, but we also use radio equipment. Perhaps the majority of birds are outfitted with this radio equipment so we could pinpoint their locations in the field and collect information about habitat, but also understand whether or not the bird was successful. For example, this nesting hen here, we can zoom in right where she's at and then monitor that nest for success. And we track across nesting stage, brood rearing stage, and adult survival stage. Now we're comparing the actual fire site from other areas, control areas, in a before-after control impact type of framework, which is kind of the gold standard for research. How you interpret this information, it's fully Bayesian, so we're working with posterior distributions, but anything to the left of that ratio of 1 is considered evidence of a decline in the impacted site, the fire site, compared to the control. This helps get at some of the temporal effects that might confound that ability to detect any response from wildfire. So we can compare it to the control. What we found here is that there's about a 70 to 90% decrease in survival compared to the control. Now, interestingly, these are two independent sites and they came up with remarkably similar conclusions. Matter of fact, when we look at the probability of evidence, how much of that posterior distribution, we're 87.1 and 86%, very, very similar across these two different areas. And also similar to other research that didn't use the Bakke framework, but nevertheless good research that we're consistent with here in Lee Foster's work in 2018. Now, when we look at survival, we see something similar. We see a high probability of effect, 87.8%, 80%, and about a 40 to 50% reduction in survival probabilities. Now, what's interesting about survival is when we've conducted some sensitivity analysis here, population growth rate's a lot more sensitive to changes in survival, largely because there's so much variation in nest success and brood success, whereas these birds are somewhat of a longer lived bird for grouse. So survival has stronger impacts on population growth rates. And there's been some good articles out there published on that. Again, consistent with other literature. So we're going to dig in a little deeper to understand why this is happening across these different life stages. Now, we've done this for every life stage, but I only had time to bring up nest survival here, but we're using all 12 study areas. This is no longer a Bakke design, but more of a modeling framework where we could look at birds who are selecting certain areas and those factors that are responsible for selection and compare it to survival and the factors responsible for survival. And we could bring in all the underlying types of vegetation and other land cover into this modeling. What we basically found is they select for high herbaceous areas, even if it's been burned. So even, for example, annual grass in those areas, they'll go back to those areas. This is because they have high site fidelity and they return to these areas for nesting after they've burned. But with the lack of shrub cover, the middle figure there, we have lower nesting survival probabilities within these burned areas. Essentially, they've lost the concealment that protects them from visually cued predators. As much of the species that rely on that overstory shrub for concealment have lost. And we've been able to map this across the Great Basin anyway, and we're looking to map this at broader spatial scales now, but the red areas indicate this high selection and low survival, which is actually now what we would consider a sink or specific type of sink, an ecological trap for these birds. And that may be a maladaptive behavior that they're selecting these sites based on the site fidelity behavior, when in fact the conditions no longer are conducive to a higher performance to the population. And you can see how well those ecological traps line up with the burn scars in annual grass that we see in the lower right figure. Also consistent with literature that's been out there regarding ecological traps for sage-grouse. Where I want to end this talk is where we're going. I think that, these models are really good at making us aware of what's happening, even developing some thresholds like that 38% around Lex. Another one that we've developed is we need essentially from our model outputs and some simulations, a 75% reduction in the rate of net sagebrush loss in order to neutralize sage-grouse populations. Now, this could be in the form of restoration activities, aggressive restoration activities like planting and seeding, or protecting those areas, or doing any type of suppression type of activity like fuels treatment, fuel breaks, those types of things. They all contribute to the reduction in that net sagebrush loss. And so we've developed some planning tools for that and published a couple of papers. We're in the process. We have a provisional release on a software that managers can use to interact directly with their site and the model parameters that come out of this research to estimate the impacts on sage-grouse. And the way this works is the user defines their area in the spatially explicit simulated management. They may have areas that they're thinking about seeding or planting, and they could run different scenarios of this and then measure the ecological benefits to sage-grouse across different periods of time, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years out, what that landscape might look like and how the sage-grouse will respond through time, both at the selection and the survival. For example, are we going to end up with an ecological trap there, or are we should we expect it to return sagebrush relatively quickly? All this depends on R&R and the type of management practice, which is all spatially explicit. But we also bring in this other important information specifically to sage-grouse regarding abundance and space use patterns of birds. For example, we might not be so interested in a site if sage-grouse aren't there. We may be interested for other reasons like the sagebrush ecosystem integrity, those types of things. But as far as sage-grouse are concerned, we bring in this other layer that gives us an idea of, helps us prioritize areas where we have real hotspots for sage-grouse populations. Okay, and with that, the take-home points here is wildfire has chronic negative impacts on sage-grouse populations across nearly the entire range. There are some exceptions and some high resilient resistance areas where the wildfire may be actually working the way it's been working for hundreds, thousands of years on sage-grouse populations, but we don't know what the future holds even in those areas with climate predictions, climate models may be changing the precipitation patterns and even underlying soil components of those areas. We have loss of habitat, a deterministic factor from wildfire, as we know that's an important impact that nullifies the positive growth that we get from increased precipitation, one of these more stochastic factors. Burned areas can act as ecological traps. We're seeing this not just for nest survival, also for brood survival. I didn't have time to go through that particular study, but this is important because sage-grouse, like many species out there, they're sagebrush obligator specialists, tend to have less flexibility in their behavior. And so when you have a rapidly changing environment like this, these behaviors become maladaptive and can lead to the demise of the species. And then lastly, the decision support tools and software could help us guide effective management practices. This research can incorporate all of that information so that we can at least have a first cut on making decisions out there. Of course, you know, more field data and professional knowledge and expertise always helps to carve out, you know, what the best practice might be. But I think these types of decision support tools can really help us get going in the right direction. And with that, I want to thank again, everybody that was involved in the research, the federal and state agencies, and particularly WAFWA, in providing the data for this study. And I think we're holding questions, but I'm not too sure. That's what we were told here. So thank you all for joining. And if you'd like any papers, feel free to reach out to me, or you know, an update on the conservation planning tools, then feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be happy to get this to you. Thank you.
Peter, thank you so much. Really fantastic talk. Yeah, really appreciate your contribution here. So as Peter mentioned, we're going to hold questions till the end. So Peter, you can go ahead and stop sharing your screen. And if you do have questions for Peter, I've seen some dropped in the chat. Go ahead and drop those in there and I'll keep track of them. And at the end, we'll come back. So our next speaker is Alissa Fogg. So Alissa, why don't you pop on your camera and hey, all right. We had a momentary scare with Alissa. She's on the front line of the atmospheric river over there in California. So we're glad that you're able to make it and join us today.
Questionable internet a lot of times in these storms.
Yes, so hopefully we'll have our fingers crossed and things will stay smooth, but thank you for joining us. So our next speaker is Alissa Fogg, and Alissa is a senior ecologist at Point Blue Conservation Science. And today Alissa will be talking about post-fire salvage logging and about how birds respond to removal of snags and overall logging activities. So Alissa, you can go ahead and share your screen and I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you. Let me just get my screens all in the right place. Okay, how does that look?
It looks great.
Okay, great. Thanks everybody for having me here today. I'm an ecologist with Point Blue Conservation Science. We're a nonprofit based in California, working with public and private partners focused on the effects of climate change. And we're scientists, educators, and restoration practitioners. And I've spent nearly 20 years studying birds and fire ecology in the Sierra Nevada. So today I'm going to be talking about a recent study my co-authors and I published in fire ecology, so focused on the short-term effects of post-fire salvage logging in the Sierra. So Sierra Nevada, it's adapted to frequent disturbance, in particular wildfire, with fire return intervals of 9 to about 25 years in yellow pine, mixed conifer forest. And fire suppression and logging has altered these conditions considerably. So now it's, dominated much more by dense stands of small to medium diameter trees, and also more shade tolerant species. So there's more fir and cedar versus pine and oaks. So now climate change and stand conditions are leading to more mega fires. These can have very large patch sizes that burn at high severity. And through 10 years of monitoring birds and fires, one of the most valuable things we learned was mixed severity fire can really promote avian diversity. And the bird community changes rapidly with post-fire succession. So some species such as woodpeckers occupy fires first, while others dependent on cavities created by woodpeckers show up a few years later. And as the shrubs grow in come the shrub nesters, and as the hardwoods resprout, you'll get more of the birds that are reliant on those oaks. So salvage logging in fires interrupts this whole post-fire succession process, and it can be very controversial. Some of the earliest papers looking at salvage logging focused on woodpeckers who are snag dependent, with largely negative effects. And meta-analyses largely summarize negative effects, with authors showing across, like 25 species, salvage logging disproportionately affects taxa dependent on dead wood. But some open area associated species can increase following salvage. And other authors also found substantial differences in bird response across regions, indicating that making these broad comparisons can be limited. And in the Sierra Nevada, only a handful of studies exist, and they're mostly focused on single species. So we were interested in looking at the whole bird community and providing guidance for the agencies managing forest lands in the Sierra. And we work closely with land managers. Our goal is to really apply our science to on-the-ground practice to help guide decision-making. And what these land managers are telling us is they need to consider the economic and the ecological consequences of post-fire management. So usually they need to harvest a certain amount of board feet of timber, and they need more information about how, where, and how much basal area to salvage. So the goal of our study was to monitor bird and vegetation response before and after salvage with treated and control locations. And we specifically wanted to examine salvage intensity, the amount of snag basal area present before and then after treatment, as well as incorporate data from multiple fires. This would help provide guidance for how managers can weigh those costs and benefits of harvesting snags versus doing other practices. So our study area was located in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, within 2 fires. We worked in the Chips Fire, started in July 2012. It burned over 30,000 hectares on Lassen and Plumas National Forests. And the Rim Fire started in August 2013. This burned over 100,000 hectares, so it's a much bigger fire across Stanislaus National Forest and into Yosemite National Park. So in both fires, we sampled salvage and control areas with similar pre-treatment conditions. So similar pre-fire forest structure, elevation, things like that. Salvage treatments were primarily by tractor logging, both in contiguous patches and along roadsides. And salvage units were much larger in Rim Fire. This was really reflecting those larger high severity patches versus in Chips Fire. And snags were, there was a snag retention strategy. They were generally retained in clumps in both fires. This really aided in operator safety, with about 10% of the snag basal area in any given unit retained. And retention ended up being overall higher in Rim Fire, as all the hardwood snags were retained. There was really like a much more oak component in Rim Fire. And also a fair amount of like the non-merchantable material was left standing during our study. In chips fire, salvage started fall of 2013, and it was completed by that second breeding season post-fire. So, and in rim fire, salvage took longer to complete, where our first post-treatment survey was the third breeding season post-fire. So in both fires, we surveyed the spring after it burned, and then the salvage occurred. And then we surveyed 2 to 3 years post-fire in chips, but then 3 to 4 years post-fire in rim. So we completed avian point count surveys during the breeding season, before and after treatment. We also had veg plots at each survey location. We quantified snag basal area, tree and shrub cover, both pre and post treatment. We use hierarchical distance sampling models, and I won't get into the weeds on that, but we built 2 models, and we ran both for each species and each fire separately, and then examined which model had better fit. So this is where we get into looking at, does salvage intensity predict bird abundance more than just salvage activity? So for the first model, we, for the treatment variable, we looked at the change in snag basal area pre and post salvage. For the second model, we just used a binary blocking variable to measure the larger effects of salvage, irrespective of amount of snags removed. And we included habitat, topographic, covariates, because this is a very landscape diverse data set. And we also included additive effect of pre-treatment snag basal area, which is something where you don't see, I don't know if I've ever seen it in any of the salvage studies, because for a lot of species, snag density is very important in terms of whether a species will actually occupy the area post-fire. Okay, getting into some results. So in chips fire, about half of the species we modeled showed a significant response to salvage. Overall, the salvage activity model, so this was that binary blocking variable, was favored over salvage intensity, indicating that birds were absent regardless of amount of snags harvested in those salvage units. We saw 4 species had a significant positive response and 11 species were significantly negative in chips. In rim fire, we saw more support for that salvage intensity response, indicating most species persisted in salvage stance, but for some of the species, it was at lower densities. And less species overall showed a significant response compared to chips. We were able to model 30 species in both fires, and 22 showed a similar response. So we did see some consistency. But for the 8 species that differed, none had significant opposite responses in both fires. So that was like kind of a relief coming from a, interpret the data viewpoint. So some of those positive responders included the seed eaters, such as pine siskin, Cassin's finch, and lesser goldfinch. Also open area species such as mountain, western bluebirds, as well as acorn woodpecker, which employs a fly catching strategy, kind of similar to Lewis's woodpecker during the breeding season. So our negative responders, which we had many more, they were among a wide variety of species, including snag dependent like black-backed hairy woodpecker, these mature forest, green forest species, such as western tanager, mountain chickadee, brown creeper, and those who favor edges, such as olive-sided flycatcher. And surprisingly, we had many species associated with green forests actually persist in the unsalvaged stands. And this was, up to 4 years post-fire. So we wanted to use our data to model different scenarios of the same amount of snag basal area removed, but varying 3 parameters. So it's fire area targeted, high versus low volume stands, and different snag retention prescriptions. So our scenarios varied from the first one. This was like a sacrificial approach where you avoid entering the fire as much as possible. You just take all your board feet from the densest snag stands. The second scenario provided more snag retention, but targeted high volume stands. And the third and fourth scenarios salvage regardless of snag volume, but with intense or intermediate salvage intensity. And scenario 5 mimicked the real data. And we also ran a model with no salvage to compare against the other scenarios. So birds per acre, this is shown on the y-axis, varied between the salvage sensitive. Those are those red blobs on the figure. Those species who responded negatively to salvage, and the positive neutral species, those are the greenish blobs. But overall, the magnitude of declines in abundance for these scenarios was smaller than what has been reported in the literature for other salvage studies. And we think that this may be due to the measures that the Forest Service took to retain snags in riparian areas, retain snags in clumps, leaving large areas unharvested, and at least in the rimfire, leaving behind all those hardwood snags and smaller diameter material. But the no salvage scenario in both fires had the highest abundance among the different scenarios, and no scenario completely mitigated the negative effects of salvage. And one thing I also wanted to point out is the salvage sensitive species had far higher abundance than those that were positive and neutral. So targeting the high snag basal areas stands didn't have as large a negative effect compared to scenarios that applied a lighter prescription. So in summary, our results mirror what many other researchers have documented in these post-fire salvage studies. Is salvage has very little ecological benefit to the short-term bird community, post-fire bird community, and benefits to seed eaters, those adapted to open barren areas are apparent, but we did see negative effects across a wide range of life history strategies. And our results differed between the fires in some ways, where we saw a significant negative response in one fire and a non-significant response in the other fire. And some of this can be explained by landscape burn severity, salvage patterns, but also the post-fire vegetation response, where in rimfire, it really had a more diverse fire history before it actually, burned in 2013. It may have been better primed for an herbaceous and shrub response, providing that structure and habitat for birds, and also had higher snag retention. So this can be a long list, warrants lots of further study, especially as we have seen more area burn at high severity in the Sierras and concurrently more salvage. And overall, our magnitude of decline was smaller than other studies. However, our scenarios did not offer a clear mitigation strategy for these negative effects. So applying these results to management is complex. There are still some broad take-home messages. So for managers, if you have to meet a basal area, like a board feet objective, increasing the area treated with a lighter touch may be worse for birds than removing as much as you can from a smaller footprint. And what this is telling us is that reducing the area salvaged as much as possible, especially if you can reduce the volume objective, appears to be a no regrets option for avian conservation. And with limited dollars and capacity available, it may be a better option to focus on promoting resilient conditions in our forests that are still green by incorporating fuels treatment where appropriate and bringing fire back in the system so that it burns in a way that is primarily low to moderate severity and can provide those small patches of high severity for those species reliant on it. So that is it. I would just like to thank the Richard Marcia Grant Foundation for supporting our research, as well as the Lassen, Plumas, Stanislaus National Forests, and our field crews for working in such cool, stark landscapes. Thank you.
All right, Alissa, thank you so much. That was a lovely presentation. And if you've got questions for Alissa, please drop those in the chat. I'm about to drop one in there. I've got mine almost all the way typed. So go ahead and drop those in there and we'll catch up with you, Alissa, at the end. So our next speaker is Greg Albery, and I'm very excited to have Greg here on this webinar. I thought Greg's contribution to the special issue or the collection was quite unique from the disease ecology perspective. And so really happy to have you on here, Greg. So Greg is a disease ecologist at Georgetown University, and he'll be talking about this review paper in the Fire Ecology issue with the title "From Flames to Inflammation: How Wildfires Affect Patterns of Wildlife Disease." So Greg, go ahead and take it away. I'll turn off my video.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for having me, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. So yeah, as Gavin said, give me a shout if this has gone wrong at all, but I'm going to plow on. So basically, the review paper that I'm going to be talking about is something that came about because I went to California once back in late 2019 and started seeing things burning and started thinking about how fire might influence infection in wildlife, because that's the thing that I mainly study. I'm sort of a disease ecologist who ended up straying into fire ecology, and this special issue was a good vehicle for it. This was our central question of asking how fire drives infectious disease, with a sort of view to looking at how global change and the changing fire dynamics in the ecosystem are going to alter the face of disease as a result. For those of you with no background in wildlife disease, one of the main reasons that we care about it is because around 70% of human parasites are often thought to be zoonotic, which means originating in animals. As such, changes in animal health dynamics can be really important for human health and for things like conservation and ultimately for ecosystem function. These are relatively recent disciplines. They've emerged sort of in the last few decades and become more prominent. And so there's lots of open questions and sort of burgeoning research areas that we're trying to address. My thought was basically that fire is a sort of relatively fundamental and important missing driver that has been under-considered in terms of its role in disease dynamics in the past, and that's what we were trying to address. So obviously we inhabit an increasingly flammable world, both in terms of extent and severity of fires, and disease is also worsening at the same time. So within wildlife and between wildlife and humans, there's an increasing disease transmission. And these two anthropogenic threats are expected to interact as time goes on through a variety of different mechanisms. Because some of these are positive and some of these are negative, they could either exacerbate or inhibit each other. And so we need to understand them both in order to draw up a plan for fire and infection in the Anthropocene. So the problem is, there's relatively limited appreciation of links between fire and wildlife disease, and only a few case studies of fires happening in a given system, and then tracking how wildlife disease has changed as a result of this sort of before and after. There's very little cross-system synthesis, so there have been very few broad analyses across lots of different systems about how fire and infection are interacting. And therefore, there's no real consensus or sort of understanding of the contingencies and the complexities of fire infection interactions. More broadly, this has meant that there's this weak understanding of fundamental disease dynamics in fire-afflicted ecosystems. And this might be a missing component of fire management and research, or understanding of things that happen in the wake of fires. And it's also a missing component of global change projections. So if we're trying to think about how infection is going to change in the future, we need to be able to incorporate how fires are going to change in order to gain a full picture of this, of what we're going to experience in terms of disease. So to start, like, forming the very basis of this understanding, we basically got together a few researchers who work in both disease ecology and in fire-afflicted ecosystems, and we tried to work out, okay, how do we think fire could influence fundamental aspects of animal behavior and immunity and things, and therefore how do we think it's going to affect diseases. So this first layer of interactions is actually how fire influences things that then have downstream effects on infection. So first is movement, then we have mortality of animals, modification of the habitat, producing pollutants and chemicals, and then stress for the animals. Once we decide on these five sort of fundamental things that fire influences that might be relevant to disease, we then expanded it to all of these downstream effects that it could have on their immunity and exposure to parasites. That's the sort of key divergence, is that there's two different levers that affect an infectious disease burden. And these are all of my co-authors, basically. So these two levers are exposure to infectious disease, which is the rate at which you encounter infectious pathogens in the environment or other infected individuals, And then the other one is immunity, which is basically how good you are at repelling those pathogens when you do encounter them. We've described these in a different paper called exposure and susceptibility, the twin pillars of infection. We call them twin pillars because they're both necessary to produce an infection. You can compare it to whether you're going to encounter another individual with COVID versus whether you're going to be able to have a strong enough immune system to repel it when you do. So I thought it was basically just a good way to spend my time during this talk to just go through a few of these levers and explain them. I'm happy to provide the paper for anyone who needs it. It's open access. And yeah, I've chosen a few different specific run-throughs of mechanisms just to sort of indicate the complexities that could be happening with fire and infection interactions. And they accompany with these sort of case studies, of which I said that there's only about a dozen or so, although that number is now increasing, which is cool. So the first one I'm going to go through is when fire drives the formation of new contacts. So the case study in this scenario is this case study in small mammals in Scandinavia. So I think it's a type of vole, Myotis glarios, which is a bank vole. They found that when the fire went through the system, which was, again, it was a sort of before and after setup, it reduced habitat complexity and concentrated voles in safer refugia. So there were areas that were less burned where the voles were safer. And that meant that by forcing them into this smaller area, they actually encountered one another more. When you increase encounter rate, it's sort of a fundamental rule of disease ecology that you're more likely to then get exposure to parasites, and that therefore increases infection levels in the population as a result. And that was what they found with this Pumala hantavirus in these voles. Interestingly, though, and this is a sort of indicator of how complex these different interactions can be, there was actually lower vole density in the area following the fire, despite the fact that they had more virus. It actually decreased the spillover risk to humans because if you have an absolute fewer number of voles, but more of them are infected, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to encounter an infected individual more often. So understanding these different links between fire, environment, animal, and human is a sort of crucial part of what we need to be filling in the next few years, decades. The next example one is sort of a mechanism that's a bit more fundamental and more often discussed in the context of fire, which is destruction of parasites in the environment. So for obvious reasons, fire has a quite sort of destructive effect on environmental parasites like ticks. And it's actually, this paper that came out in 2015 does a really, really good job of summarizing this specific area of the literature, just talking about how when fires go through ecosystems, they obviously sort of cleanse and destroy parasites. And parasites that have environmental stages, which includes a very wide range of them, are then less likely to survive. And therefore, the hosts, the wildlife, are less likely to encounter one of those parasites. And that therefore reduces infection risk in fairly fundamental ways. It's possible that this has been used actively to actually manage ecosystems. And there's a sort of really wide range of different sort of like herbivore parasites and things that have been, fire has been suggested as an active control measure. It's quite interesting. Another mechanism is destruction of resources, which acts through, basically this habitat modification link. Resources themselves are a really important component of your own biology, and it also funnels directly into your immune system. This is an example of a link that hasn't actually been shown for fire yet, but we have strong suspicion that it will. Generally, what you find is that if you restrict the diet of a wild animal or of an animal compared to a sort of healthy lab animal, you end up seeing a reduced immune resistance. So animals that are less able to repel infection. And so this is an example of one of these experiments that was done in wood mice in the UK, where they found that actually what they did was they supplemented some individuals, but not others. And they found that giving more food to certain individuals gave them a lower worm burden, effectively. And that's measured by egg count, basically. So the suggested mechanism here is that because the immune system is costly to maintain, if you destroy resources, it means you have weaker immunity, and that could therefore lead to an increase in susceptibility and therefore an increase in disease. Okay. This final one, I think, is acting through pollution, which is again another immune-mediated mechanism. Lots of different studies have found is that obviously fire produces harmful chemicals, which is a fairly fundamental aspect of how fires work. If you increase mercury accumulation in the environment, because mercury has a sort of active effect on the immune system, it can change the way that it is that you repel infection. And I'm sort of pairing this study about mercury accumulation in fishes with this study that recently came out in birds, waterfowl, which showed that actually, as you have more mercury in the environment, flu prevalence increases, which is taken to indicate a sort of weaker immune system, weaker ability to repel them. Because there's lots of problems with mercury, particularly in aquatic ecosystems in the wake of fire, we suspect that might be a really important aspect influencing disease in the sort of long term after a fire has gone through an ecosystem. And this is actually just basically talking through what I just said. So there's a load of different examples of things like this happening, or changing transcriptomics in your immune system in the wake of all these pollutants being produced. But the list of pollutants is very long, and the list of ways that it could influence your immune system is also very complex. So we have yet to get a very good understanding of what this might have, what effect this might have beyond probably bad. So this is the example that I was talking about with the transcriptomics. They found in sea otters off the coast of California that they produced polycyclic hydrocarbons, which altered the immune transcriptomics, and therefore presumably changed their resistance to infection. Although because there's no actual disease work in this, then we're not sure quite what happened to the infectious diseases. So this is the whole the series of different routes that we've outlined here, but as you can see, there's loads of ones that we haven't talked through and loads of different possible examples. But there's also lots of others that since the paper came out, we've yet to be other mechanisms that have come out that we didn't actually anticipate when we wrote the paper. So another possible one is that human interventions might have an important role. There was this study in these frogs, in their tadpoles, looking at how two firefighting chemicals themselves actually influenced their survival and growth. Basically, every aspect of their biology was influenced. And it's very possible, or very plausible, I would say, that the immune system was being influenced as a result. But as yet, we don't have any studies on that. We're not sure quite what might be happening to disease in the wake of it. So a sort of another general expansion of our framework, I guess, in the future is that it might be that human activities themselves, efforts to reduce the threat of wildfires, could have unintended consequences, which may or may not act through infection, particularly when survival is involved. I think that infection is often a sort of a likely culprit. So that's just representing all of the sort of unknown mechanisms that we have yet to think about. But we're still kind of in the process of expanding this framework and moving on with more and new investigations and trying to write new reviews. So if anyone has any ideas for things that we might not have considered, or if you read the paper and you think, I reckon I can refine some of these hypotheses, do let me know, because I'm keen to find out more. Once this is all worked out, there might be some hypothetical sort of consequences to fire and infection in sort of like applied context, I suppose. So this knowledge could sort of feed through into fire management in wild areas. So for example, if you understand how fire influences infection in deer, it might influence their browsing and therefore alter downstream fire dynamics. That's that little schematic. It could also influence our conservation plans and how we understand how infection works in the wake of fires in these populations. That's shown there. And finally, we could use it to monitor and help control spillover of parasites into humans. Understanding how fires are going to change our risk is going to be important for designing interventions and hopefully eventually leading to a healthier society. And this is particularly, I'm focusing a lot on California in these sorts of areas because there's lots of fire data and lots of disease data, and it's a good sort of case study for things like this. So hopefully once we've worked all of this out a bit more and expanded all of our sort of case studies and our data sets, we'll be able to inform this second question I have, which is more grand scale, being able to build in fires into projections of disease ecology. We're doing this a lot with this institute, which is where I work in Georgetown, which I helped co-found, called Verena. We are focused on open data sets and trying to sort of build this data ecosystem, which hopefully we'll be able to use to answer these questions in the future. So I have our Twitter and website there if you want to see. Anyway, thank you very much for listening.
All right, excellent. Thank you, Greg. And if we could go ahead and have the other speakers, Peter and Alissa, you guys want to flip on your webcams if you're able. And we're going to transition into sort of a Q&A time for our remaining time. We may or may not use up the rest of our time. It kind of depends on how many questions we got, but we definitely have a few in the chat. And if you have more, please drop them in now. It's a great time to get those in. So first of all, thank you to all the speakers for those great talks. Really great stuff. And I encourage folks to go and read the papers that they presented on more fully in this special collection. So I'm going to start by what we ended on. So I want to throw a question over to Greg, and then we'll go to the chat. So Greg, I loved the review. I thought it was really interesting and thought-provoking, and something I rarely think about, how disease connects to all of this. So I thought you covered a lot of nice mechanisms that have been shown in the literature, and also some, pointed out some potential gaps. I wonder what empirical data would you like to collect to fill an existing gap?
That's an interesting question. I think so. There's two different elements that I think we could do with using. One of which is they sort of move at different axes of data collection. One is, I think, having deeper and more expansive sampling of phenotypic and environmental characteristics along a sort of fire gradient in a few case studies would be a good idea, and really, really informative. Things like sort of comprehensive pollutant monitoring alongside monitoring the behavior of the animals involved, and obviously their own infection and immunity. I think the problem is that there's so many different things that could influence infection in the wake of fire that trying to sort of comprehensively get all of these different elements is quite difficult. But something that I've heard is actually something that people are quite interested in doing, and people have drawn up plans to do it before. So that's one of them. And the other, I think, is actually sort of, in the opposite direction, is just more expansive, like weather station, like collecting of disease data and aligning it with fires that have happened sort of in the area or in the systems. Sort of more meta-analytical approach to be able to draw generalizable conclusions, basically, rather than being able to just say, okay, it's happened in this one system in this one way. Sort of the eternal ecological problem, really. But I think the more that these studies keep coming out, the more feasible it will end up being. So I think that's good news.
Excellent. Thank you. So I'm going to start harvesting questions from the chat. So if you have more, keep dropping them in. The first one, I won't ask the one that I asked first. I'll save that for later. But the first question was for Peter. So Peter, would low intensity prescribed fire be beneficial in these ecosystems, speaking of the ones that you were focusing on, or is it also detrimental in the same way as high severity fire? And that question was from Kaya Allen. And then Carrie Metlin followed up and said in another way, how does the assessment account for different kinds of fire? So specifically varying burn size, burn intensity, patch size. So can you talk a little bit more about sort of how fire severity, configuration, things like that kind of play a role in the questions that you're asking?
Sure. Yeah, good questions. Something that would be very relevant for managers, and needing to be studied even better than what's occurred in the past. What I could speak to with the range-wide study, where we used the fire database, we refined the information going in to only be moderate to high severity data. So this does include also fires, prescribed fires in there, although far less area prescribed fires is represented than actual wildfires, and our target was wildfires, but we didn't have any real way to tease those apart. However, the severity had to be strong enough within a prescribed fire to make it into the analysis. Based on the MTBS data, which we know has some issues with severity basically because of the index used there, and the timing of the year of which the remote sensing was done, those types of things. But I will say that there hasn't been a whole lot of studies out there on prescribed fire. We did find in the eastern portion of the range a different interaction that we did everywhere else. And this happens to be an area that has higher resilience and resistance. It happens to have lower severity fires. And we actually saw something that probably mimics what's been happening for hundreds of, maybe thousands of years with sage-grouse and wildfire and sagebrush ecosystems, and that those pulses of fire, which are typically smaller in size and less severe, generate a better age-structured community for sage-grouse and work to the benefit of sage-grouse. And it turned out that precipitation with net sagebrush loss was a positive impact rather than negative impact for sage-grouse. So it actually, as you had more net sagebrush loss, which wasn't nearly as big as some of these other areas, you actually had a more positive response for sage-grouse populations. So that's what we've learned from our data sets, which are limited. The data sets in the past, I would say there's been some published articles out there specifically to sage-grouse that have shown that prescribed fire is not beneficial for sage-grouse populations in some field studies. Conley and Reese produced an article back in the 1990s to show this, and then it's been followed up with several other studies. There hasn't been really any evidence that prescribed fire helps sage-grouse, simply because they really rely on sagebrush cover for concealment, and somewhat in that evolutionary arms race with the predator out there and an animal that's so cryptic, anything that you do to take that away will have an impact on that specific life stage. I will also say that areas, it depends on the area. If the prescribed fire probably occurs in a high resistant area in order to promote forb growth, invertebrate diversity, all of those types of things that are good for sage-grouse during the brood rearing stage, it might be beneficial. So I think where you go is going to make a difference. How big the fire is, how intense it is, those types of things are definitely factors. And we're looking into this now. We're using the Land Digital Treatment Library database, which does have a lot of prescribed fire information to look at what the response is to sage-grouse across the different types of prescribed fire, something that really hasn't been done at the range-wide scale, and we're doing that at this time. And I'm going to follow up one more thing here, though. We did see that influence in the brood survival or brood stage, which they selected these areas in early brood and late brood rearing that had fire, largely because again, that forb and invertebrate abundance that comes out following the fire. However, over time, if it converts to cheatgrass, and we did find this to be the case, those also function as ecological traps for these birds. They continue to go back to them, but without having the integration of sagebrush for cover, the chicks are unprotected, and we end up with lower survival probabilities, which result in longer term to lower population growth rates.
Great, thanks, Peter. I'm going to ask the next question to Alissa. So Alissa, I put this comment in the chat as well for people to read. But I'm curious if you've looked at community similarity or beta diversity metrics between those areas that were salvaged and were not. And my specific question is, like, are those bird communities different in terms of their composition? And if so, which I would expect that they might be, is it kind of a nestedness problem where the salvage community is just a subset of the green forest community, or is it kind of a turnover situation where you have different communities there of different species that are unique?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we did not look at a community diversity analysis. I kind of, we've thrown around these ideas. I kind of wish we had, and we're really interested in like pulling in the green forest as well, salvage, that whole gradient. we did look at diversity and salvage versus unsalvaged in our scenario testing, and found that diversity, was really highest in the no salvage. And so my hunch is that because of how salvage was done, I would say, and this is like from on the ground, spending a lot of time in these fires, is there's not a lot of dissimilarity. I mean, it's probably your same group of species because of the amount of retention left on the ground. And this is on public land. We're not talking private land. So that is my hunch, but there are, we detected, probably like 125 species, and we only analyzed, I think, 47 of them. So if we had looked at, done like a species occupancy model, I think we probably would have pulled out some oddballs that just showed up in the salvage areas that are not forest birds whatsoever, Sierra Nevada forest birds. They would be more adapted to those open, barren areas, ground foragers, but it would be really interesting just to kind of look at that gradient of beta diversity across salvage, unsalvage, and then, include the green forest as well.
Well, that'll be for your next submission to Fire Ecology. Yeah, thanks for answering that question, Alissa. All right, next question I'm going to throw over to Greg, and this is from Alissa. So, it's just, I guess, the choir talking to itself a little bit. But so, Greg, do you know of any studies looking at how cultural burning with indigenous communities may have managed disease prevalence among animals or plants with fire? One example I can think of is managing acorn pests and parasites with the Klamath River tribes here in California, but I'm sure there are others.
So I think it's something that we've been talking about a lot, and I'm currently working with some people who are much more knowledgeable about indigenous fire practices than me. I think I'm very ready to be proven wrong, but I haven't actually found yet a sort of verified example of this. I haven't, like where it's not for wildlife disease. I think it's getting from fire to plants is one step, and getting from fire to plants to animals to their diseases is I think so it's like far removed enough that that's one of the reasons that it's relatively understudied. But I would be very surprised if it hasn't been used in that way. I think, it's obviously been used to manage the land, and disease is such an emergent property of the land that I think that it's very likely that it has been. But if anyone knows of any specific studies, I'm more than happy to be sent.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks for that question, Alissa, and Greg for the response. So, Peter, I'm going to throw a question over your way. This is from Matt Slifko. Any indications on influences to predator-prey relationships when comparing burned versus non-burned habitat in your system?
Absolutely. I think when we modify the environment, it definitely changes these predator-prey relationships, isoclines, so forth. Theoretically, as a lot of the components of that habitat provide refugia for sage-grouse in this case, but many other species. So what we've done in the past, other research, we've put video cameras out on nests to capture the predator community under different types of vegetation cover, and both within fire areas and outside of fire areas. And it turns out that visually cued predators are more likely to find sage-grouse when you're missing that shrub component. And most species of sagebrush die directly from wildfire and have to resprout from seed. So it takes a long time for that sagebrush to come back, which leverages the predator. These grouse return to these same areas. They're using bunch grasses or whatever kind of clump of grass, or even patches of sagebrush that exist on the landscape, which isolates many birds into one smaller area, and predators cue in on that. We've seen raven predation rates go up much higher. With the video camera work, we showed that with a reduction in sagebrush cover, you increase raven predation specifically quite drastically. And that's important to point out because raven populations are increasing dramatically across Western landscapes, pretty much, everywhere within their range, but specifically in sagebrush ecosystems at a very, very high rate, largely because of anthropogenic subsidies on the landscape that serves as resources for ravens to help benefit their survival and reproduction. So we see a lot more eyes in the environment with ravens, and then that loss of cover kind of causes higher predation rates on sage-grouse when you lose cover from wildfire. But there's other species as well that are visually cued that I'm sure are increasing their predation rates given the loss of habitat from wildfire.
Great, thanks, Peter. Last question that I see in the chat is one from me, so I'll ask half of it and leave the rest for later. But so my question is for you, Peter, which is those population projections that you were showing. Those did look pretty dire for some of the regions that you're studying. When I see those types of analyses, I think like what bends the line back towards flat. Yeah. And so I was curious, what kind of possible intervention could be taken to push that line towards zero or even positive? And a sub part of that question is like, how much of the variation have you been able to explain with these models you've developed, or are there still a lot of factors we don't understand in terms of what might be able to bend that line?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and something that we are focused on. Obviously, this is one that's going to get back to management and application and what we need to do, what strategies are best, where do we go? All of those types of questions come from something, a bigger question like that. And we could use the models to develop these thresholds to understand essentially what we need to do to neutralize that specific effect. As you mentioned, there are other factors on the landscape. Fire is by far not the only one impacting sagebrush ecosystems as a whole, or sage-grouse populations. But when you hold all those other factors constant, it turns out, and I mentioned this in the talk, that we do need a 75%, this is from previous work, we're calculating these out now with the range-wide analysis and looking at regional variation in this threshold, but a 75% reduction in the rate of net sagebrush loss as a result of wildfire and wildfire alone. Again, once you hold all of those other factors constant, now even with the growing anthropogenic subsidies on the landscape, crop type conversion, all types of other factors that are influencing sage-grouse populations, conifer encroachment, energy development, and so forth, their populations, even if you neutralize fire, will continue to decline unless we get a handle on those ones in a similar manner. But that 75% reduction can come from many factors. Speeding up the recovery process will reduce the rate of net sagebrush loss on an annual basis, and knowing when and where to do that is important. And that's what our conservation planning tools allow users to actually play with and figure out the best strategy for their site. But the most, and we've done an analysis on this, are we going to recover our way out of this if fire cycles continue unabated? And the answer is absolutely not. We need to do more protection and suppression in areas, because we're going to lose those that sagebrush altogether and to this irreversible new state of cheatgrass and other invasives within those areas. And so looking at what areas merit the most protection and understanding using R&R maps, resilience and resistance mapping to guide those strategies, and what types of strategies, whether it's targeted grazing practices or fuel breaks, initial attack, how to set up, operationalize a little bit more, strategize so we could get quicker to those fires. All of that becomes, I think, key in order to prevent the burning from taking place there. We do see variation in this across the range, and I will say this too, we're looking at a sagebrush ecosystem integrity index in the new conservation design strategy. for sagebrush ecosystems. And what we did find, and this is a little bit, I think, encouraging, is that populations are growing where that integrity is high, where it doesn't have so much anthropogenic development and wildfires. And so we do see I guess you could look at pristine, consider these areas pristine, growing sage-grouse populations. So getting, relying, I think, on some of this research to direct us in a way that we can actually reverse these declines. I think that's encouraging, that if we could get the sagebrush ecosystem integrity up to those levels, then we would have growing populations of sage-grouse across the range. And there's some areas where they're doing fine, like the eastern portion of the range. We're actually seeing them kind of come out of this population nadir, this low point, and move back up. And again, wildfire seems to be functioning, at least in a lot of those areas, not all of them, but more like what it has been for thousands of years.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Peter. So that concludes, I think this concludes our Q&A session and this week's webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Corey. And Corey, you want to close us out?
Yeah. Hey, thanks everybody. Again, the speakers in particular, thanks for sharing your research with us today. Really appreciate it. And for everybody attending, just a quick reminder for those participants, as you leave, please fill out the survey that should pop up on your screen once you check out. But yeah, thanks again, everybody, for taking part today.